Welcome everyone to this update on SARS-CoV-2. I'm your host here for this, Dr. Chris Martinson, and today, well, first I want to congratulate everybody who's still listening. You are the curious, you are the honey badgers in this story, resilient, sticking to it, being very persistent and badgering as we claw our way through this particular story. Now, this coronavirus has been really tricky and bedeviling, and I'm convinced the preponderance of data says that this thing came out of a lab. And that explains a lot of what we're seeing here because it's highly, highly tailored for getting into human cells. And it doesn't just come in through one receptor sort of weakly like you would expect from a species jump. It comes in with the highest level of affinity through the ACE2 receptor for humans, but it comes in through a bunch of other receptors as well. Neuropilin, CD147, all these other receptors. So it can get into our white blood cells, our nervous tissue. It comes in through all the different ACE2 receptors, which can be found everywhere in the body. Well, not everywhere, but in a widely distributed sort of a place. Lungs to testes to throat and nasopharyngeal tissues to the intestines. It's everywhere. All right, so I want to get to a couple things today, but first is this idea. Is this a novel virus after all? Not really, no. If we think of novel as new and original or not like anything seen before, that's how this thing was built. In fact, this virus is still built this way. If you go to this, I just went to a website and found this description here. It says, COVID-19, the disease caused by one virus, the novel 2019 coronavirus, now called SARS coronavirus 2 or SARS-CoV-2. So at any rate, is it really novel? And I think the answer is no. I came upon this idea from this article here, and this is the author is Beda M. Stadler here, a former director of the Institute for Immunology at the University of Bern in Switzerland, a biologist, professor emeritus, a very important dude, apparently. And he likes to use provoking language, they warn in this article, but should not deter you from the extremely important points he makes. It's a great article. I would really highly recommend it. Here was one point that he made, which was pretty interesting to me. In mid-April, work was published by the group of Andreas Thiel at the Charité Berlin, a paper with 30 authors, amongst them the virologist Christian Drosten. It showed that in 34% of people in Berlin who had never been in contact with the SARS-CoV-2 virus showed nonetheless T-cell immunity against it. T-cell immunity is a different kind of immune reaction. See below, they tell you about it. This means that our T-cells, that is the white blood cells, detect common structures appearing on SARS-CoV-2 and regular cold viruses and therefore combat both of them. So if 34% of the people in Berlin were already cross-reactive to SARS-CoV-2 before it even came along, was it really novel? Was it really unlike anything seen before? Well, not according to our bodies. Our bodies had seen this before. 34% of the people had seen something close enough to say, got it, I can do this. Therefore, not novel at all. And this is an idea we've been building on for a little while. We have a lot more data coming in. It's pouring in hard and fast right now. Here's one from August 4th. I found another one from yesterday. And this is talking about selective and cross-reactive SARS-CoV-2 T-cell epitopes in unexposed humans. So just like the Berlin study, unexposed humans, epitopes means the surface shapes of the proteins. And so at any rate, this is pretty interesting what they found here. Look at this. In unexposed individuals, suggesting pre-existing cross-reactive T-cell memory in 20 to 50% of people. So they've got the CD4 plus T-cells have been reported in up to 20 to 50% of people. So here what they did was they mapped 142 cell epitopes across the SARS-CoV-2 genome, and they were looking for all this cross-reactivity, a lot of tables and data in here. But it says that the varied or variegated T-cell memory to coronaviruses that cause the common cold may underlie at least some of the extensive heterogeneity observed in COVID-19 disease, which is a fancy way of saying, hey, some people don't even seem to have symptoms. Other people end up dying. That's a pretty heterogeneous response right there. And so that extensive heterogeneity is maybe explained by the fact that we have these T cells. Remember, there's two big types of immunity you might have, and one is the B cell or the antibody-related immunity, and the other is the T cell, or the cellular immunity. So a lot of data pouring in now that the T cells are very important to the overall disease progression, that they play a big role in identifying coronaviruses and fighting them, and that in some cases, for some people, the type of cold viruses they were exposed to gave them cross-reactivity to SARS-CoV-2. Therefore, it's totally not a novel coronavirus. So that's important. I think that's a really good part of this story. Again, I'm not really all that thrilled that we have this one coming around because it is so well tailored for humans. That makes it potentially a little bit unlike the other ones. But the good news is it's not totally novel. That's the great news. And that begins to explain some of the things that we're seeing, I think, in terms of how and why it moves through a population, how and why it does so. Many people seem to not be affected at all, how and why children seem to be, air quote time here, pre-immune, why other people seem to be pre-immune to this thing. Well, it's because they already have immunity against coronaviruses, and that's the point here that Mr. Stadler is making in this particular article. He makes a number of other good points in there, so you might read that one. That's a good one. And remember, we've been trying to explain this particular thing here we've seen where we see over and over and over again the case where these curves look the same for country after country after country, especially those that had fairly weak, not even, they look strong, but fairly weak contact tracing coupled with lockdowns and things like that. So places that really went after this aggressively, caught every single case when they first found them, when they first came in, countries that really battled this, New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, China maybe, who knows what's going on in China. That the theory here is that absent complete control over the virus, right? The virus just overwhelms the country. It just romps right on through. And then it's largely done. Not gone, but largely done. That first wave is the most brutal. It finds your most susceptible people, causes the highest death counts, all of that. And we're starting to see other places with curves that are showing up like this. We got to add South Africa now to the same exact case count here, where, again, there's that exponential increase, that first explosive exponential rise. It just looks like it's just never going to stop. And then all on its own, it does. And it comes down like this. We are seeing the same thing in Florida, really exponential rise. It's starting to come down, although some people would say this because Florida has stopped testing quite as much as they used to. If you don't test, you can't find the cases, right? Certainly there's some of that, but I would think as well, Florida is just following what we now know to be a fairly typical pattern here. All right, and this one, more observations for the so-called XYZ theory, which if you don't know about it, that's X and Y and Z are just variables where we're talking about things that might give you immunity to SARS-CoV-2, and some of that is pre-existing immunity. Some of that is people who get T-cell immunity. They don't get antibodies. And other people get the full antibody immunity response. X plus Y plus Z adds up to herd immunity. So this, Jan Weiss is just making a couple of good points here, and it says, importantly, this doesn't mean some interventions can't help. So interventions certainly help. But we simply cannot ignore the fact that Sweden never shut down, never closed schools, never wore masks, and reached the same results as those who did. So New York State had its big explosive rise, and it came down. And this is looking at deaths per million, so this isn't cases, so that can be skewed by a few things. And Sweden, I don't know if it's quite... You can't quite say just that Sweden never shut down, never closed schools, all that, because why? Well, the Swedes are kind of naturally socially distant people anyway. So they had the social distancing thing down kind of before SARS-CoV-2 came along. But at any rate, they didn't do all the rest of that stuff and seemed to see about the same amount of same sort of disease trajectory. New York State with about 13.4% antibodies, Sweden with 14.9 here on these two particular sets of data right here. I don't know if those are the right data or not. I don't know if you can add up New York State's antibody prevalence because it's such a big state, and Manhattan's very different from upstate New York near Ossining or wherever, right? It's just totally different place. So this fits with the XYZ theory, though, that once you get somewhere between around 15% antibodies, give or take, that you will see that you develop something that feels a little bit like herd immunity. All right. So there's more and more coming out around this all the time. This just came out on the 14th here. Herd immunity may be slowing spread in the U.S. as study finds 40% community infection provides protection. So a couple things came out of this. This is from that same article, and talking about this 40% level right here. And it says, however, people may develop at least some form of immunity after infection. Some form of immunity. That could be T cell, could be B cell, something like that, right? Meaning the number of individuals who are vulnerable to the disease in hard-hit areas, such as southern states that have recently seen large spikes in infections, is dropping. According to pandemic analyst Trevor Bedford at the University of Washington, Trevor goes on to make the point that that it could be that as few as 20% of people who are infected may give you a useful amount of herd immunity because the other people have gone through social behavior changes, right? So that's part one in this story. So Trevor's saying, hey, maybe it could happen around 20%. We've quoted Trevor's work before, and he's a pandemic analyst. I mostly follow him on Twitter. But this 40% number comes from this study right here, which also came out on August 14th. It's a mathematical model, so a model, reveals the influence of population heterogeneity. Hey, that's twice for that word in one day. Heterogeneity meaning, of course, it's the differences across the population on herd immunity to SARS-CoV-2. And this was kind of interesting. It says here, herd immunity can be achieved at a population-wide infection rate of approximately 40%, considerably lower than previous estimates. This shift is because transmission and immunity are concentrated among the most active members of a population, who are often younger and less vulnerable. All right, so there are these super spreaders, right? These are people who they're very social, they're very engaged, they go out, they get this thing, they encounter 100 people in a day. Introverts might encounter 0 or 1 people per day. So these super spreaders are important to that. As well, there are other people who are just in jobs that require them to be more interactive and interfacing with the public. At any rate, whoever these most active members are of the population, once they've become infected and then they are immune, they are taken out of the equation. So it's not like we're all just, if you have 100 people in a population, we're all equally infectious and infective. Not true. Some of us do a lot better job at being super spreaders. Others, not so much. So once those super spreaders are out of the equation, it's not like you have to hit 70% of everybody. If you can just get the super spreaders out of the equation, and they're arguing here that's exactly what happens, that makes sense. Intuitive sense makes sense there. As well, people who are most at risk will also sideline themselves. They will take themselves out of the story, and the people who are potentially susceptible to this, the elderly, the people with immune compromised systems, people with comorbidities, they will very often, once they read the writing on the wall, take themselves out, and they're no longer in the game either. So both the people who spread this the most widely, as well as the people who would be most susceptible, both of them get taken out of the equation relatively early in the story, and that contributes to this 40% number instead of the typical 70 to 80% number that we were talking about a few months ago, which is the number that you would have to use if you were immunizing people with a vaccine. So if you gave me a vaccine, you said, Chris, this SARS-CoV-2's got an R0 of 3.4 to 6. How many people have to be immunized in order for you to hold this thing in check? In order to achieve herd immunity, the calculations are not that hard to come up with. 70-80% of people would have to be immunized. But that's just randomly, we're hitting all 70-80%. If you can get smart about this, if you just immunized, again, the most susceptible and the super spreaders, you could probably drop that number really, really down. In fact, the super spreaders are the ones I'd want to hit most. All right. As well, they continue here, continuing on, quote, if non-pharmaceutical interventions are very strict, no herd immunity is achieved, and infections will then resurge if they are eased too quickly, or even at any speed. I'll bet you infections will then resurge. So this is the trap, I think, that those other countries, which I really admire for how they got on top of this pandemic. And by the way, if SARS-CoV-2 had been really novel, if it had been more deadly, you absolutely would have wanted to live in one of these countries, that like Taiwan, New Zealand, etc., South Korea, who really got their arms around this and were able to trace and track and quarantine and stop this virus dead in its tracks. Countries that couldn't stop it dead in its tracks, like, South Africa or Florida as a state, these were countries and states that just got really walloped by this, that if this had been a worse disease, it was really going to just be... Places like this were just unequipped. Maybe next time, if there's a next time, and we get to see a worse one, we'll be better able to manage this psychologically and culturally, but not so far. That's a no. But it does say now that with places that have not gotten to that herd immunity threshold, they still have their date with it at some point. So the price of doing all that contact tracing and keeping this thing out of your country now is either eternal vigilance against it arising again, because it will. It's going to come in on a cargo container ship. It's going to land on a plane with an asymptomatic individual. It's going to get there somehow, and then you'll face that resurgence again at some point in time, unless you are eternally vigilant. All right, and so the XYZ theory, I have to put a plus on it now, because I think a couple of good points emerged from looking at this and reading about it a little more. So the X was the percent of the population that has the pre-existing immunity. Call it what you will. I don't know what the correct term is, but kids seem to just be pre-immune to this thing for whatever sets of reasons. And then Y percent of people, they get exposed to SARS-CoV-2, but they don't develop antibodies. Maybe these are the people with the mild cases or even the asymptomatic people, but they get T-cell immunity or maybe some other cellular immunity. We don't know yet. These are probably the mild cases. And then Z percent of the people actually develop traditional B-cell antibodies. And by the way, the people who get the more severe cases tend to have the higher antibody titers so far. All right, but when we see this coming somewhere between 10 and 20%, we see these sorts of shapes of the curves happening. I don't know what the seroprevalence is in South Africa, but I do know that for New York State and maybe for Sweden and places like that, when you get to that seroprevalence of 10, 20%, that's what you see. Well, now we got to put the plus. The plus on this is plus social behavior changes. That word traditional shouldn't be there. Let me cross that right out. I don't know what that's doing there. So as the super spreaders develop immunity and everybody else changes behaviors, this drops the R naught. So the R at some time T, the RT is if it was 3.4 and it gets down to 1, we want to get it below 1. How do we do that? We do that with all these social behavior changes, mask wearing, social distancing, hand washing, things like that. All right. So those social behavior changes plus getting the super spreaders out, that tells us then that herd immunity now is X plus Y plus Z plus these social behavior changes, the SBC, and that's where we get our herd immunity from. All right, that's what that looks like. So I think this is developing more and more. There's a bunch of papers coming out now about T-cell and other things like this that are really talking about how we're getting to herd immunity rather much more quickly. All right, moving on. Kind of interesting, hydroxychloroquine. Look, I don't want to beat the horse on this thing. I just wish to God can we just have a proper randomized controlled trial that's administered early. It's hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, right, plus zinc. You do that, we can get our answers. But there's something really ugly going on with this that keeps me on this particular story. So this is maybe not the ugly part of it. This is another fairly large study that came out here. And what did they find? They found that hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin seems to improve outcome of admitted patients. I'm not sure why they were so soft with this. They might have had to have used soft language like that in order to get it into print, because it's a very politicized thing right now. They reported no major cardiac adverse event of this combination therapy. And here's why I say seems to improve is really weak language for this. So what did they do? They had 132 patients were admitted. So this is hospitalized. This is a later study than I would have liked to have seen. I want to see the hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin plus zinc administered as early as possible. They did that as early as possible in this study, but once people came to the hospital. All right, mean age, 59 years of age. They had C-reactive protein levels was 84 plus or minus 71 mg per liter. 46% had lymphocyte count of under 1,000 per cubic millimeter. So these people were kind of hit, already pretty far along the chain here. When prescribed, anti-infective agents were lopinavir, ritonavir, so 12 people got that. Azithromycin, AZI, 28 people got that. And azithromycin combined with hydroxychloroquine, that's both of those things, N equals 52 of those people. Between the two periods, they noted a significant decrease of ICU admission from 43% to 12% with a p-value of 0.0001. That's highly significant. Delays until transfer in ICU were similar periods with a p equal 0.86, so not a statistically significant finding. Pulmonary CT scans were significantly more performed from 50% to 90%. Again, very, very significant. As oxygen dependency, again, significant. And prescription of azithromycin plus HCQ from 25% to 76%, again, very significant, were greater over time. Multivariate analyses showed a reduction of unfavorable outcome in patients. Reduction of unfavorable outcome in patients receiving AZI plus HCQ with a hazard ratio of 0.45. Again, a significant finding, especially among an identified category of individuals who had lymphocytes over 1,000 and C-reactive protein over 100 mg. All right. So at any rate, so they found very significantly that this hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin really did improve the outcome of admitted patients. But again, this is admitted patients. This is too late. Not too late because it helped, but we want to see this stuff administered as early as possible. But again, this is just another study that just came out recently that just said, hey, it works. And by the way, if we saw things like this with p-values like this and with hazard reduction ratios like this, that was a fancy new compound that came from some big pharma company that cost $3,000 a vial, trust me, you would be hearing about it in very, very favorable lights. Instead, what we have today in the United States is that doctors recently wrote an open letter to Fauci. This just came out a couple days ago. And they very nice preamble and they very, very respectful and all of that. But then they had a series of about 30 questions that they wanted to ask. And I thought they did a great job lining these questions up because the way they line up shows standard deductive reasoning. Pretty good stuff. So here were the questions they posed to Fauci. Number one, they said, there are generally two stages of COVID-19, symptomatic infection, initial flu-like symptoms with progression to cytokine storm, and respiratory failure. Correct? Okay. So there are two stages of COVID-19 symptomatic infection, right? You have the initial part, and then you've got the later part. The initial flu-like part where the virus is replicating in your body, and then later you have the cytokine storm and respiratory failure, right? So they're just saying, hey, there's two parts to this, right? An early stage and a later stage, correct? The answer is yes, of course that's correct. When people are admitted to a hospital, they are generally in worse condition, correct? Well, yes, that's correct. There are no specific medications currently recommended for early outpatient treatment of symptomatic COVID-19 infection, correct? So these are people who have the initial flu-like symptoms, but it's still early outpatient treatment. There are no specific medications currently recommended by Fauci, by the pharma business, by the FDA, correct? The answer is correct. Remdesivir and dexamethasone are used for hospitalized patients, correct? Yes, that's correct. There is currently no recommended pharmacologic early outpatient treatment for individuals in the flu-like stage of the illness, correct? Yes, again, that's correct. Is it true that COVID-19 is much more lethal than the flu for high-risk individuals such as older patients and those with significant comorbidities? Correct? The answer again, of course, is yes, of course that's correct. We all know that. Individuals with signs of early COVID-19 infection typically have a runny nose, fever, cough, shortness of breath, loss of smell, etc. And physicians send them home to rest, eat chicken soup, etc., but offer no specific targeted medications. Correct? The answer again is correct. Number 8, these high-risk individuals are at high risk of death on the order of 15% or higher. Correct? The answer yes to that is yes, correct. Number 9, just so we are clear, the current standard of care now is to send clinically stable, symptomatic patients home with a wait-and-see approach. And again, that's correct. So they've just laid this whole thing out very carefully just to ask all the questions they could to say, look, there's early stage and later stage. People who are early stage, they go to their doctor. Even if they get a positive test, doctor sees that they have symptoms. They've got fever, shortness of breath, maybe even they've got runny nose. They feel terrible, like they've been hit by a truck. And the doctor says, yeah, go home and eat chicken soup or whatever makes you feel best, or just rest and drink plenty of fluids. So it's like, but there's no specific standard of care here. And that's absolutely the case. Number 10, they get right into it. Are you aware that physicians are successfully using hydroxychloroquine combined with zinc and azithromycin as a cocktail for early outpatient treatment of symptomatic high-risk individuals? This right here is a really important question. Is Fauci aware that physicians are successfully using HCQ? All right, here's the fun part. In 2005, Anthony Fauci's name is on a scientific paper showing that hydroxychloroquine is effective against SARS Classic and treating SARS Classic. At least in vitro, they figured that out, and they had some cell models for that. So that was proposed by none other than Fauci back in 2005 as a cheap, effective remedy for going after classic SARS. So why we wouldn't make the jump to this not very novel coronavirus, which we should have, obviously it had, set 80-some% sequence homology to classic SARS. So we should have known or suspected that anything that we were trying for SARS would have been things we'd be trying for SARS-CoV-2, right? That makes a lot of sense, right? Somehow that hasn't really happened. All right, continuing on, number 14, they ask again, to be clear, your recommendation is no pharmacologic treatment as an outpatient for the flu-like symptoms in patients that are stable, regardless of their risk factors. Is this correct? And the answer is, yep, that's absolutely correct. 15, would you advocate for early pharmacologic outpatient treatment of symptomatic COVID-19 patients if you were confident that it was beneficial? Well, I hope the answer would be, of course, yes, of course we would do that. I'm laughing because I'm not so sure that we could make that into an of course. Are you aware that there are hundreds of physicians in the United States and thousands across the globe who have had dramatic success treating high-risk individuals as outpatients with this cocktail? 17, are you aware that there are at least 10 studies demonstrating the efficacy of early outpatient treatment with the HCQ cocktail for high-risk patients? So this is beyond anecdotal, correct? And that is correct. 18, if one of your loved ones had diabetes or asthma or any potentially complicating comorbidity and tested positive for COVID-19, would you recommend wait and see how they do and go to the hospital if the symptoms progress? Or would you do something else? 19, even with multiple studies documenting remarkable outpatient efficacy and safety of the hydroxychloroquine cocktail, you believe the risks of the medication combination outweigh the benefits. True or false? All right, again, a really damaging sort of series of questions here, laying it out in a very, very deductive fashion, just laying out the case a little bit like a prosecutor would, which is maybe why I admire this, because this is kind of how I think. But it's just saying, look, we don't have any pharmacologic treatment. We have these people who are at high risk. These high-risk people are facing potentially a 15% chance of death, which is very significant. And we know that hydroxychloroquine is ridiculously safe. It's not going to kill 15% of people. It's not even going to kill a measurable percentage of people, if it's even going to kill any of them at all. And we're going to, against that risk that hydroxychloroquine might have a side effect that could be bad, we're willing to risk 15% deaths in high-risk patients. So that's what they laid out there. Here's where we get into the meat of it. So let me see if I can get this here. 20, is it true that with regard to hydroxychloroquine and treatment of COVID-19 infection, you have said repeatedly that, quote, the overwhelming evidence of properly conducted randomized clinical trials indicate no therapeutic efficacy of hydroxychloroquine, end quote. 21. But none of the randomized controlled trials to which you refer were done in the first 5 to 7 days after the onset of symptoms, correct? These were all late trials. and we've been covering this extensively all the way through, asking over and over again, where is our double-blind placebo-controlled trial on hydroxychloroquine administered early with azithromycin with zinc, right? Where is that study? Well, Fauci keeps pointing to all these ones that mysteriously they only try hydroxychloroquine in patients after they're in the hospital, sometimes after they're on ventilators, just as a last Hail Mary. Geez, all this other stuff isn't working. My patient's crashing and dying. Let's just throw some HCQ in. Oh, it didn't work, right? Of course it didn't work. That's like administering an airbag to a car accident victim after they've crashed. It probably ain't going to work very well, might even harm them. 22, all of the randomized controlled trials to which you refer were done on hospitalized patients, correct? That is correct, all of them so far. Hospitalized patients are typically sicker than outpatients, correct? Yes. None of the randomized controlled trials to which you refer use the full cocktail consisting of hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin, correct? Yes, that is also correct. 25, while the University of Minnesota study is referred to as disproving the cocktail, the meds were not given within the first 5 to 7 days of illness. The test group was not a high-risk group. Death rates were 3% only, and no zinc was given, correct? Yeah, and that University of Minnesota study was also just ridiculously poorly done, super poorly done, really poor. We took that one apart a long time ago. Awful. At any rate, again, for clarity, the trials upon which you base your opinion regarding the efficacy of HCQ assessed neither the full cocktail, to include zinc plus azithromycin or doxycycline, nor administered treatment within the first 5 to 7 days of symptoms, nor focused on the high-risk group. Correct? Yes. So again, the overwhelming evidence, he says, of properly conducted randomized clinical trials indicate no therapeutic efficacy of hydroxychloroquine, but they weren't done within the first 5 to 7 days. They didn't include the full cocktail, and they weren't focused on high-risk groups. So, just awful. Bad science. Junk science. Terrible. Where is Fauci on this? What is going on here? 27. Therefore, you have no basis to conclude that the hydroxychloroquine cocktail, when used early in the outpatient setting, within the first 5 to 7 days of symptoms, in high-risk patients, is not effective. Correct? No basis to conclude that. 28. It is thus false and misleading to say that the effective and safe use of hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin has been debunked. Correct? How could it be debunked if there's not a single study that contradicts its use? Well done, doctors. Little golf clap there. That's a great series of questions. These are all very legit questions. And it says something else is going on here. I don't know what it is yet. Is it money? Is it greed? Is it just ambition? Is it something else? But there's not science going on here. Not coming from Fauci, not coming from a lot of doctors. I think the whole thing just shows the degree to which medicine has become about money and politics, but not about science. That's what bothers me here. This is deductive reasoning right here. And you can't say that, well, actually, let's go on and find out what Fauci really says about this, because let's go on. So first I had a what the moment going on here when I read this one. FDA denied Henry Ford, that's the center that, well, anyway, let me just read the title. It'll become obvious. The Henry Ford Center's request to continue using hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19 patients after hospital released controversial study. God, what the? So get this. So days after Detroit's Henry Ford Health System released a disputed study. We're going to get to that in a minute. Remember that disputed study. That sounds awful, right? A disputed study. You know what was disputed was the massive fraud study that Surgisphere fraud put upon the world that came out of Brigham and Women's, right? And went in Lancet. That was a disputed study, and now it's a disgrace study. So there's no way. This is awful seeing what the press is doing here with this one, right? All right. Let's just continue on before I get too worked up. Released a disputed study in July saying it found that the drug hydroxychloroquine was effective in treating COVID-19 patients. It asked the Food and Drug Administration for emergency use authorization to continue using the drug for some patients. The FDA denied that request this week, the Detroit Free Press reports. The FDA denied the use of hydroxychloroquine for patients. The FDA first revoked emergency use authorization of the drug to treat COVID-19 patients in June, saying the FDA determined that chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine are unlikely to be effective in treating COVID-19. A number of high-profile studies were abruptly halted when the drug was found to have adverse cardiac effects on some patients. This right here, 100%, is the fraudulent Lancet study that was a massive, massive data fraud, scientific fraud, proven to be fraud. I've searched and searched and searched. If any of you can find this, please show it to me. I'm looking for the name of a single person who has died as a direct consequence of taking hydroxychloroquine under appropriate medical care as when given for COVID-19. I have not been able to find. I'm a pretty good researcher. So when they say adverse cardiac effects on some patients, I'm looking for, well, what are they? And not just hints that there might be some or they think they've seen some, but show me the data. Show me the actual data on this, which includes either names of deceased people or actual studies with verifiable data showing that there's legit effects. But by the way, severe cardiac effects are things that actually COVID-19 imposes, because we now know that up to 78% of all people who even had mild cases have detectable heart abnormalities and, in many cases, heart damage as a consequence of COVID-19, not from hydroxychloroquine. So we already know that I mean, if this is awful. This is really bad what's happening right here. Because it just shows the degree to which this has just gotten all messed up for no good reason. Hydroxychloroquine could very well prove to be an effective treatment for some COVID-19 patients, but a randomized double-blind study has not yet found that to be the case. Well, it's August. I first started calling for, I put out the design study parameters for this thing in April. You could have had this thing done by May, right? We should have had a proper randomized double-blind study for this, following the logic train that those doctors laid out, which is you give this thing early. It's an antiviral. You want to give it early in the disease. Typically, as soon as you know about the symptoms come up, don't even wait for the positive test. Just give it to anybody who's got positive symptoms. It's really a very safe drug. It was completely safe before COVID-19 came along. Somehow now the FDA and other people have managed to whoop this up into being the most dangerous drug ever, but it's complete poppycock. And if one does, I would be the first to admit it and promote it, Fauci said. Well, how about, hey, Fauci, how about, because you take some of that massive, giant pile of money you got for vaccine use and you take $1 million and shunt it off and actually get the study done. That I challenge you. Why don't you do that? Following the backlash of its disputed study, Henry Ford said it would no longer comment on the drug outside of the medical community. Unfortunately, the political climate that has persisted has made any objective discussion about this drug impossible. We are deeply saddened by this turn of events, the health system said in a statement. This is a very, very sad statement right here that you even have to say something like this. This is awful. It's an indictment of what's going on in the United States in particular, but maybe elsewhere too. This is really bad. And no longer comment on the drug. It's just too politically explosive. It's hydroxychloroquine. It's been used for 70 years. Come on, people. So at any rate, when they said released a disputed study, I followed this red link right here to find out. And it took me to this article right here, which said Dr. Anthony Fauci is among the experts who are critical of a study by Detroit's Henry Ford Health System that found the drug HCQ lowered the death rate in COVID-19 patients. But when asked about the study during a congressional testimony on Friday, Fauci said it was flawed and had a number of issues. So here's how he disputed it. The study analyzed 2,541 COVID-19 patients and found that 13% of those treated with HCQ died, while 26% of those who did not receive the drug died. That's a 50% benefit. And by the way, they were just doing this retrospectively. They didn't have the chance to give this as early as they possibly could. I think 13% is still too high of a death rate, but even with that, it cut the death rate by 50%. That's a massive finding. But the issue, Fauci said, is that the study was not a randomized double-blind study, which is considered the gold standard in science. In other words, doctors carefully selected who received the treatment, which could skew the results. Well, it could, but would you suggest it would skew it by 50%? That would be rather remarkable if that was the case. If so, you should be talking to those doctors and ask how they picked those patients that well, because that's pretty awesome. Fauci said that some of the patients were also receiving corticosteroids, which could have influenced the results further. Yes, that's true, but you can't deny corticosteroids to people who have respiratory distress because that would be unethical, because we know that corticosteroids work in that, and that's an important point to be said here, is that you can't always decide that you're going to tease everything apart because to do so would be unethical. And by the way, in the remdesivir trials, which Fauci is pretty favorable of, a lot of those people are also receiving corticosteroids, but that doesn't bother him there. That study is a flawed study, and I think anyone who examines it carefully is that it is not a randomized placebo-controlled trial. So that's his main thing. So, but that doesn't mean it's useless. This is 2,541 patients. Would it be better if it was randomized? Of course it would. Would it be better if we had azithromycin and zinc in there? Yeah, you better believe it, right? But that's what they were calling a disputed study. The only person disputing it is Anthony Fauci. Anthony Fauci, who doesn't have any answers that are legitimate to any of these questions right here. So you want to talk about, he can dispute it all he wants, but Anthony Fauci is a disgrace that he can't answer these questions right here. Absolutely a disgrace. Because you know what? People are dying. Actual real people are dying in this whole thing to score political points, to make a couple of extra Gilead pharma bucks, whatever the story is, right? It's just awful. Well, let me show you again. Last time I talked to you about how the media is not to be trusted. And I say, no wonder people aren't trusting the media. No wonder doctors say they're dealing with significantly more patients who resist their advice because of misinformation they read online. Doctors say it's hard to get some patients to heed medical advice because they're convinced of misinformation about COVID-19 they read online. The New York Times just reported some patients demanded their doctors prescribe them hydroxychloroquine despite reputable evidence that the medicine is not effective for treating COVID-19 and has potentially dangerous side effects. Well, this is BS and junk right here, okay? So again, as the doctors laid out, are there any reputable studies that were done or in an early outpatient setting that included azithromycin and zinc? No, there aren't. Only the studies that cast aspersions on hydroxychloroquine were all ones that were designed magically by people like Fauci and other doctors with similar inclinations as Fauci to design them in a way that you could look at it and say that's designed to fail. It's going to fail. They're going to give it late and then show you it doesn't work. They're applying airbags to car crash victims after the crash and saying, look, it made them worse. Airbags don't work. Well, let's look a little deeper into this article. It says, this was part for the article. It says, this is no longer just an anecdotal observation that some individual doctors have made. Daniel Allington, senior lecturer at King's College London. Oh, I see. This is a statistically significant pattern we can observe in a large survey. Allington is also a co-author of a recent study that found people who got their news online were more likely to believe in conspiracy theories and not follow public health guidelines compared to those who got their news from radio or television. Ah, yes. So the chance of a UK researcher not finding that the appropriate thing to do was to follow only the news and get your news from an official government source, the chance of that not happening was like zero. This is the nanny state over there where like 2 million cameras tracking people's faces everywhere, and people aren't even allowed to defend themselves from a violent attack in their own homes without getting in trouble. They got stuff going on over there, but one thing you can always count on is that you're going to find that UK researchers are very much in favor of you getting all your news from radio or television, no matter how bad that is. Some patients have demanded prescriptions for HCQ, a medication that the Food and Drug Administration revoked from emergency hospital use for COVID-19 in June, after studies found it was not effective against the virus and had potentially dangerous side effects. Geez, there's that same language again. Huh. We see this language all over the place, right? So at any rate, this is sort of what's going on in this whole story right now. And it's just reached comic proportions. Of course, there's a huge tragedy, so tragicomic proportions at this stage. Awful. Just really awful stuff. And by the way, the person who was first on the scene with the combination of hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, and I remember at the time, early on, azithromycin, I was a little skeptical. I'm like, what? Why would you give an antibiotic? This is a virus. Or, okay, maybe you give it because the virus damages the lungs so bad and azithromycin is there to help treat any subsequent downstream infections that might come from bacteria who are opportunistically coming into damaged lungs. That's what I thought it was. But in fact, that was from research from Dr. Didier Raoult, the iconoclastic French professor who first spearheaded that particular combination because of his work where he had noted during earlier research in his career that azithromycin actually had a very strong effect on controlling Zika virus. So he'd already seen an antiviral effect of that earlier on. Now we're developing understandings about how that happens. By the way, doxycycline and azithromycin both work on this in a similar fashion to inhibit an RNA subunit. So it's possible that those two compounds are actually directly inhibiting viral replication. I'll keep digging into that. But at any rate, Didier Raoult was very much at the front of that. And by the way, I don't, the media has sort of been giving him a rough ride. So I started to look into him a little bit more and came across this quote by him that I really liked. He said, quote, "I am a Nietzschean. I am looking for contradiction, trouble to strengthen myself. The worst is the comfort. It makes you silly. The more humans you have, the less they think differently. The politically correct, the compliant thinking are only a mass effect to be avoided, even if it is difficult to resist. To follow the herd, no brain is needed. Legs are sufficient. I don't like movements. I run in the opposite direction. In general, that's where there are nuggets." Hey, I agree with that a lot. That makes a lot of sense to me. I love that. The worst is comfort. It makes you silly. Well, at any rate, there's quite a lot of comfort in people's thinking about, how we're going to get through this and all of that. And by the way, I do like the fact that there is a cheap, simple way to control the coronavirus. A number of you sent this to me. This is work by Michael Mina and talking about, hey, if we had simple at-home tests for the coronavirus that involve just spitting into a small tube of solution, this could really, really be an important tool to halting the spread of the pandemic. In particular, if you can pick that up in asymptomatic people, if their saliva actually has enough virus particles, that would really help. Because if you can take people who've got this thing, get them in quarantine, they stop spreading it, that would be awesome. And in fact, if you could do this, if you could get a readout within 15 minutes, maybe this could be part of getting on an airplane or going into a club or something like that. That could really be awesome. If you do test positive, your next step would be to self-quarantine. You notify your doctor to confirm the result, maybe with a standard swab test. And then confirmation would give public health officials key information on the virus's spread and confirm that you should remain in quarantine until your daily test turned negative. I think that would stop it pretty quickly. All right, the path forward for SARS-2, I've mentioned this a few times, but let's just go over it one more time. Because, everybody prepares their terrain. You take vitamin D, you eat well, you sleep enough, you avoid stress, all those things. Everybody wears a mask, right? Practices social distancing, right? And the mask and social distancing, both, if you do get it, you start with a lower inoculum, a lower viral load. If you start with a lower virus load, you have a better disease outcome, meaning a less severe one. All right. And of course, at-risk people take all the extra precautions they need. If exposed or illness is suspected and caught early, you take HCQ plus and or ivermectin. I think ivermectin is showing itself to be really awesome here. Within 2 days of symptom onset, all right? If symptoms progress, you go to the Math Plus protocol. If symptoms get worse than that anyway, well, then advanced therapeutic support is necessary. And maybe later a vaccine comes along. But we don't have to wait and hope if we take all these earlier steps up here. Steps 1 through 5 above, okay? All right. Conclusions for today, with 20% up to 50% of the population already pre-immune to SARS-CoV-2, obviously it's not novel, right? You can't be pre-immune to something that's novel. That doesn't happen. And herd immunity may be reached with just 15 to 20% of the population seropositive due to this pre-immunity, coupled to the dynamics of how super spreaders catch it early and taken out of the spreader pool, and then others change their behaviors. So that alone might get us to what would constitute enough of herd immunity to get the case counts to fall like we see in chart after chart after chart. Hydroxychloroquine, hey, it's been given a really bad, very bad treatment by Fauci and others and the large pharmaceutical interests and all of its affiliates and allies and other compromised doctors and things like that. I don't think it's gotten a fair run here. I think it's anti-science what we've seen so far. That's what bothers me. I don't have a dog in this fight. Nobody gets rich off hydroxychloroquine. It's an off-patent medication. It's super cheap. I don't actually, if we had a full randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, AZQ, HCQ plus with azithromycin and all that and zinc. If we had that and it said doesn't work, you know what happens? I changed my tune, right? But we have all of this so-called anecdotal data, thousands and thousands and thousands of patients run through trial after trial after trial where it shows a very strong benefit, dropping mortality by 50%, preventing the disease from getting as severe as it might otherwise get. We have that. That's too much data to overlook at this point in time, right? Still to this date, though, we do not have that proper HCQ plus RCT trial administered early in time. And we have to ask, why the hell not? Why not? Why do we not have that at this point in time? Why do we not have that? I don't have a good answer for that. I only have bad answers. So what do? It's best. You got to think for yourself here and you got to come to your own conclusions about everything. We have a way of thinking that's, at Peak Prosperity and my website and everything I do. It's just about how to think. It's more about the how you go about thinking and how you formulate questions and how you know what you think you know is true. The how is more important than the what in this story. So make sure that you're following your own curiosity. You've been listening this long. You just made it through another 50-minute presentation by me. Congratulations! But you've been sticking with this story as it unfolds. That shows you're curious, and that shows you are part of the tribe that gets the how in this and wants to uncover the truth, such as we can. All right. At any rate, too many people have died. It just didn't have to be this way. I think there's just really shameful behaviors have gone on so far all across the medical community, around this, in political community, in corporate community, if I can even use the word community with certain companies out there. All right. Remember, you can have your own personal immune booster set here. Quercetin, zinc, D3, these things are all very important. As well, elderberry syrup if you do get the flu or cold or something like that, feel it starting. Great stuff. Vitamin C, N-acetylcysteine. And if you want to get a t-shirt and join the movement, just get a t-shirt, send a pic of yourself in it to info@peakprosperity.com. We'll post it right here to our Instagram site. And remember to keep harvesting your garden. Ours is just really just throwing out massive quantities of food right now, so we're busy trying to figure out how to preserve it. Biggest cabbages I've ever grown. Massive kale. I don't even know what to do with it all right now, so working on it. Remember, resubscribe to this channel if you have to. People get unsubscribed all the time. Thanks, corporate, Google, YouTube state. But at any rate, do that if you need to. And if you liked this, if and only if you liked it, and you think it would be important for somebody else to see this, hit the like button. Very simple to do. Wander down, click it, and then that helps other people find this information too, because that's how the YouTube algorithms do work when they're working for us. All right, that's all I have for today. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you in a couple of days on Thursday. Bye-bye.
Hi, folks. This is Adam Taggart, Chris's co-founder at Peak Prosperity. To get your own Resilient shirt, simply go to peakprosperity.com/shirts. Each shirt is made of 100% organic cotton and produced in the USA. And when your shirt arrives, please send us a photo of you wearing it if you feel comfortable doing so. We'll add you to our wall of proud Peak Prosperity members who are showing the world that resilience is the way to a better future. Thanks for watching.